So you know this feeling probably all too well. You've set yourself a goal, you've basically achieved it, but before you can even celebrate, you think about, I should have done this better, I could have done this, I could have done this little thing better for me. But this self-judgment, this harsh truth is really brutal for high achievers, leaders, anyone who's aspiring in that field. Because ultimately, rather than focusing on how far we've actually progressed, we just raise the bar even further. So this pattern that is driving, like the pattern that isn't driving your success is actually limiting it. So we actually want to look at the framework of how can we completely change this approach to achievement to be focused on feedback and growth. And we'll talk about why we do the hard things first, both literally in your day and figuratively in your mindset, and creates a foundation for that sustainable self without the real burnout that comes with that self-criticism. So whether you're, leading the team, you're aspiring in educational leadership or creating a business, or simply you just want to perform at your best, this is the shift that you really need to take to focus on that appreciation and strategic reflection and how that will actually transform your results rather than beating yourself up. Because remember, success leaves clues. If we can focus on what's working well, we can actually improve going forward. So let's talk about what I call the high achievers paradox. So let's just really straight off acknowledge that the very drive that makes you a successful person, a successful teacher, leader, it's the same source of your greatest suffering. Because when you're not performing at your optimal peak, you are usually thinking, I should be working, I should be doing this thing. And like Tony Robbins would say, you'd should all over yourself, where you always think you should be applying and doing this extra effort. But realistically, that is the thing that suffocates our growth, because we're really amazing at setting goals, pushing through the obstacles and creating those results. But there's the dark side of that personal development and really drive for ever-ending improvement. And when your identity becomes fused with achievement, you create this dangerous equation, and it's really your worth can be equal to your results, and that in itself is deadly. Now, you would have heard my phrase, effort equals results, but we just need to make sure we don't tie our worth to those results, because this really leads to that relentless cycle, that thing that you consistently are looking to impress, to feel like your brief moment of satisfaction, and it's immediately to raise that bar to the next level. Like take me, for example, when I started running for the first time, it was like, okay, look, I'm going to run to the end of this bridge because I literally couldn't run. And then I felt like I was dying, but I made it. I sort of celebrated that win. And then I just kept raising the bar. Okay, I went a couple of 100 meters, then I went a few kilometers, then I went a whole lap around the river, which was 7Ks at the time. Then that turned into an ultra marathon, like it took it to the massive extreme. And I just kept raising that bar because I was like, oh yeah, I can do more. And it should be better if I continue it. But I can see this all the time in the coaching that I'm doing with educational leaders and executives. They hit these sort of record milestones. They've achieved these awesome results for their academic skills, the momentum of their staff or their team. And one metric out of all their entire plan has just fallen short. And they really just immediately go to the criticism. Oh, but I could have done this, I could have done that. And I saw this actually with a beginning teacher recently. I was mentoring them through this lesson, and they just had no sort of self-worth. Well, they tied their self-worth to the outcome of that lesson. And what was evident was I only asked one question. I said, what went well? And immediately they went from, I think I asked some good questions, to about 10 things that they could have improved. But I just had to stop them. I said, I didn't ask what you could do better. I asked what went well, because I could clearly see in that moment that that's what they needed. They needed the time to reflect on the win rather than looking and talking about all their mistakes. Because this isn't just perfection, it's a fundamental misunderstanding of how growth actually works. And it creates that culture, whether it's in your own mind or it's across our entire organization, where people are afraid to fail. They're hesitant to take those risks, and they're consistently exhausted from trying to outrun their own impossibly high standards. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't have high expectations and high standards, but we need to put a nice proportion into reflecting on how far we've actually achieved and celebrating those wins, as well as where we're going to next. Because that's that real balance. If we don't do it, that's caught in that high achievers paradox, the play between the two. And if we focus on the one, the other one will just get let go. So let's just jump into some more practical aspects of how do we actually solve these problems in our leadership, in our coaching as high achievers ourselves. So I love this thing where Tony Robbins, if you haven't heard of him, is amazing business entrepreneur, but basically he's a peak performance coach. You can put it that way. He just transforms people's lives through his teaching, through his just delivery. And he has this concept from shifting your expectations to appreciation, because that becomes so powerful. When we expect things to become sort of the default, disappointment sort of becomes inevitable. You're consistently going to be let down that expectation has been met. So I'll give you a quick, simple example. Like I put a content sort of milestone to say, I'm going to record one reel and put it out every day for 30 days. Look, I made it to about 23 days and then I got sick and then I couldn't do that. And then the self sort of mentally beating myself up that I was failing, that I couldn't do it, that it's not enough, actually became just debilitating, because then I lost momentum and then I couldn't actually bring myself to create again. But when we shift from appreciation or expectation to appreciation, everything can change. It's not about lowering our standards, but becoming complacent, like it's about recognizing the value in the process, not just the end outcome. So another example is when I first started really creating and making this sort of leadership push in education, when I was first a head teacher, and we talk about the role of a leader, there's usually two things. One, you need to be the distributor of resources. You need to identify what needs to be fixed, what needs to be improved, what needs to be strengthened, and what resources, time, money, people, energy, what are we going to put behind that? That's one of the main priorities, you as a leader. And the second is that vision. You need to have a clear vision and hold that bar. And you need to hold it well, because you are setting the standard for where other people need to raise to. Now, the issue with that is if we focus on the wrong thing, that we aren't achieving XYZ. Like, for example, I had a faculty strategic plan. I put together this thing. It took me a week to put together, and we had all these milestones. Each term we were going to do X, Y, Z, and I distributed out to the different leads in the team. So you're doing the program for this, you're doing the program for year 7, you're doing the one for year 9, and here's the support and here's the structures. But when inevitably things got in the way, things came up, people got sick, realities had to change, we missed those sort of milestones, and it was easy to fall back in we're behind now, we need to catch up. But there was just a simple shift that helped me sort of in that reflection. And it's to look at those milestones, look at those sort of projects, and instead of jumping immediately to what could have we done better, I ask these 3 questions first. So what went well? That is my go-to. Anything we do, what went well? That's why I said when I was mentoring that beginning teacher, first question I asked them, what went well? Because as educators, we can tend to focus on where do we need to improve rather than reflect on that positive feedback. And we know from the research that positive reinforcement is actually going to exponentially increase engagement than if we use negative, because it is that carrot and the stick. What are you driven by, pain or pleasure? What one? Most people, they prefer pleasure. That's why they seek comfort. That's why they seek certainty. So reflecting on what's working well or what went well in daily practice or your team or that milestone we're trying to hit can really affect how we shift from expectation to appreciation. Now, the next question we want to look at is, what did I learn? because it's easy to think about, I just did this task, I just did this thing, but sometimes the hardest lessons are in the biggest challenges. And when you expect a situation to go a certain way and it didn't, they can be the best lessons only if you're open to learning from them. I've had some really strong mentors in my life, and they've been teaching me the fundamental principles of like learning, because you can come in and go, yeah, I know this, I know how to do this, but a mentor and a sort of coach is there to push and guide, and but also just challenge you. What are you learning? What are your assumptions that's working? So that second question, what did I learn? Reflecting on what are you learning right now? Because remember, successful learning is the changing of a behavior. If you do the same thing over and over and over again, you're not learning something new. You're just repeating the same thing. So new learned behavior is when we see something change. So if you are going through that reality of, expectations are high, nothing's changing, well, nothing is getting learned. So we need to go back to what went well, focus on that strength, and then what do I learn now? And one of those other questions I like to use is, how have I grown? Because it's easy, again, focus on where we are now, but rather than where we've come from. Within that X amount of time, within those few years as a head teacher, what did I learn in people management, in relationship building, in sort of motivation and collegiality and driven sort of success? Because only after answering these questions did I move to areas of improvement. So you first have to build the base of what's working well. And I make sure I'm specific, focusing on behaviors and strategies rather than making global judgments about capabilities or worth. Now, that's a really important thing. What is the strategy we did well? What is the behaviors that our students or our teachers or our staff actually sort of exhibited? Because it's easy, or it's harder, but we don't want to put a judgment on people. It's about the strategy that they're implementing. And that is that feedback culture. And we'll talk about that later. About accepting feedback is another thing in itself, because some people just don't want to hear it, even if it is reinforcing an area that they are learning well, but they don't want to hear that. And this creates that psychologists sort of like, as psychologists call that, growth mindset, where challenges become opportunities rather than their threats, where feedback becomes information rather than a judgment. Because remember, there's a phrase Marcus Aurelius uses, the obstacle is the way, the only way forward is the way. But we need to identify what's working well for us to actually progress through that obstacle. So this brings me to another really powerful concept from Stephen Bartlett. He's the author and leader of the Diary of a CEO. And it's to master something, you really need to create the obligation to go and teach it. Now, being an educational leader, you guys being educational leaders, this is where we are sort of coming into our sort of realm. We need to teach what we are learning. If we are learning communication skills, teach them to others. If we're learning marketing, communications, it doesn't really matter what it is. Trying to teach it or build the capacity of others is how we actually transform our own knowledge. Because this transition from positioning yourself as a teacher rather than, look, I know it all, but I can't communicate that in a way that's effective for others, forces you to really think clearly and identify the principles behind what's actually worked, and the approach your own mistakes with curiosity rather than criticism. Because if you are like claiming to be the teacher, the expert, you need to be able to break it down in a simple way. So when we commit to being teaching or a teacher and what you're learning, there's several things that can happen for us. You will actually start paying more attention to the process rather than the end outcome. How are you delivering this? How are you actually engaging your staff or your team? You are able to articulate these insights in more concise ways rather than just sort of vague. Now, you think about this in our practice. If we are, teaching a design technology class and we have to break down this really complex process called the design process, we don't just say you start here and you finish here. We break down all the different steps in between, and we sort of break them down, and then we break them down into subsets, just so we can articulate and communicate that really complex thing to the level of learner that we are actually approaching. So it's the same thing with us as the learner or the teacher ourselves. So there's these 4 things that are happening. Remember, you're talking about them right now. you pay more attention to the process rather than the outcome, you're articulating those insights more clearly, then you're creating this accountability for your own growth, because you want to get to a certain level of understanding or mastery to be able to communicate that way in an effective manner. Because when we feel like we don't know enough, then we sort of have this imposter syndrome come into it, rather than, look, we're just one step ahead of our student. It's more about ability to break that down into easy, manageable, bite-sized pieces. And when the last thing we actually notice when we start moving into that teacher mode, for especially for ourselves, teaching this skill, is we actually get more compassion for when people fail. And that makes us more self-compassionate when we fail to meet these goals, because we're teaching people how to do this thing that we're learning. It doesn't mean you have to go and start a YouTube channel, become a formal mentor. They're great options. However, teaching can be as simple as just documenting your process, sharing your learnings with your team, or just simplifying things, what's worked for you, and people want to see what's worked. Remember, there's those 6 human needs, and certainty is one. Certainty that this thing is going to work. And if you can save your team time, because remember, teachers are extremely time poor. If you can save your team time, they will follow you in whatever you're trying to do. And that's how you can, again, remember that, distribute your resource, but then hold that vision. If your vision is to save our team time but make massive impact, well, how are you going to do that? You need to lead by example, and you can do that through teaching, because teaching is a way of mastering those skills. Because remember that growth mindset, we're shifting from I need to be perfect to I'm just gathering insights that can help others. This creates a powerful sort of feedback loop where your own growth becomes fuel for others, and their questions and perspectives really just enhance your learning. But then you can actually give context, you can give relationships and examples to things to make sort of that connection. So now let's get to another real practical sort of advice or tip that I like to use. Now, as you know, I'm a deputy principal, and we have to deal with hard conversations all the time. And so this is a real practical thing of doing the hard things first. One of the most powerful applications of this mindset shift is embracing the principle of swallowing the frog. Now, it's basically doing the hard thing first. This concept comes from Mark Twain. He said, if your job is to eat a frog, it's best to do it the first thing in the morning. And if it's your job to eat 2 frogs, it's best to eat the biggest one first. So sometimes we have to deal with the hard thing. And if we leave it to the end of the day, and you've probably had this experience, if you leave it to the end of the day comes up and you feel exhausted to handle it, or you're just not in a sort of place of strength to be able to bring yourself to have this challenging confrontation. So in other terms, this means you're tackling the most challenging thing at the end of the day through willpower and force. And you want to shift that to when your willpower and force is at its peak, and that is in the morning. That's the first thing, when you are deep in that sort of psychological benefit of beyond productivity. When you consistently face difficult things just head on, you'll build this, what I call discomfort resilience. You train your brain to recognize that hard things are doable. Making this phone call won't kill me. Having this really hard complaint to deal with, or this really challenging conversation, it's temporary. Discomfort's temporary, and your capacity grows every time you deal with this challenge. And this can just completely transform your relationship with feedback and reflection itself. Instead of avoiding the uncomfortable truths or difficult conversations, you just develop a capacity to actually take that on board directly and productivity. So just for an example, hard things first. When I was a head teacher, I had to deal with a really challenging issue. I had stuffed up. I seem to have given overall feedback to our team that one person felt that it was a targeted attack on them and their ability to do the job. My intention was not that. However, that individual saw that, hey, look, by not doing this thing, with letting down the team for programming, and because we had an audit for HSC coming through, they felt like I had wronged them because I'd shamed them in front of the team, where there was no actual targeting in that kind of thing at all. However, what that did is it created a big rift between me and that person, and then me and that person and the rest of the team. They actually isolated themselves into the workshops. They actually distanced themselves. They literally cold, sort of stonewalled communication between anyone who wanted to approach them from the team, including myself, would get a grunt, would just get walked away. So I had to do the hard thing first. I had to eat that frog. I was going home racking my brain day after day after day, just trying to figure out what have I done. But I didn't know. I just had to go and do the hard thing first. As soon as I got in there in the morning, I had to use a framework that I learned by Chris Voss, and it is get the no first. And what does that look like? It really was like, is this a bad time for you? If they say yes, go away. If they say no, it's not a bad time, then you can engage, because a no from the other person, that gives them psychological safety that they're in control of this conversation because they've accepted you in. It was a first step, and it was a hard step to take because for 2 weeks I'd been stonewalled by this person. So having that sort of framework in place to go, okay, well, I'm going to ask a no leading question first, just so they feel comfortable in control of what we're about to talk about, and then use the Stephen Covey sort of framework of seek first to understand before being understood. What is the real problem here for you? And label it. You're upset. I can see you're pissed off at me. I don't know what I've done. However, look, I want to move forward and I want to sort of work well together, continuing on. Just label what's going on. And that opened up a bit of vulnerability to, look, I felt like you shamed me in front of the team. I feel not like I'm not valued. These kind of things, which I was just sort of blown away because I didn't expect it at all. But that's how this person has sort of taken it on. So you can do the hard thing first. Remember that discomfort was temporary, because that 15-minute conversation fixed to a degree the problem of non-communication, and we can move on. And my capacity as that leader worked and grew because I could deal with this hard challenge. I could deal with this awkward confrontation and move it into a collaboration space rather. So let's just think about some practical examples. You can have those hard conversations first. It's first thing in the day. Like I would have to make a phone call saying, look, I don't have good news. I've got this person's getting suspended, whatever it might be. If it's your personal development, your way you want to start your day with a habit that you're most resistant to building. And what I mean by this is, if you really hate reflecting, you hate journaling, those kind of things, don't do something you hate, but stack the thing that you're wanting to do on top of something you already do. So for example, if you're getting a coffee in the morning, what is this thing that you need to do? Not you should do, you need to do, add it onto an already existing habit because it's easier to actually implement them. And then tackling those most difficult parts of your project when you've got the most energy. That could be creative work and written work or production of resource. That can happen in the morning if you don't have any like complex relationship things to do with. Because that sort of common thread is facing the hardest things first. You build momentum, you build confidence, and you get clarity that actually carries through to everything else. So let's talk about how do we actually start really implementing this into practice and turning it into a culture of feedback and reflection. So whether you're just trying to take your own mindset on, or you're trying to build a culture within your team or your organization, here's just a couple of key things that I've done that I've found that work. So we need to create a structured sort of reflection habit. This can be, a daily 5-minute review of what's working well. What have you learned? What are you doing tomorrow? That is literally something I would put in every single one of my lessons for my stage 6. What went well today? What did you learn? What could you do differently tomorrow? And the reason I put it in, because time management is always a punish when it comes to projects for industrial tech, design and tech, just anything practical. So deeper sort of review. And one of the things I did as faculty head teacher was to put in check-ins once a week for 15 minutes before I ran off to an executive meeting. I'd do a once a week, 15-minute, what's working well right now? What do we need to communicate? And it was a tone medium that this is not a full staff meeting. This is not one of those. It is core key information that's going well. Let's celebrate the wins, and then let's communicate what do people need to know so we can actually reflect on, are we aiming, are we going for those key goals? Are we on our way? We then look at, comprehensive assessment for growth, achievements, you got area for personal development, coaching, all those kind of things. But you want to look at those frameworks that we put in place, those mechanisms that emphasize our growth over our judgment. Now, let's talk about personal. The feedback for growth is in the information as behavior. It's not our character. If we identify and label ourselves as this specific sort of character, then it's really hard to shift. Like, for example, when I was getting into running, if I said I'm not a runner, which was a mindset I had at the time, that was really hard to shift when I started running. But when I actually, ran a half marathon and then ran a marathon, people were saying, "Oh, you're such an athlete." I didn't see myself as an athlete. I didn't see myself as a runner. I thought I was a non-runner. I didn't run, but I was doing it. I was achieving these things because my character was fixed to this different kind of judgmental model and identity that it didn't serve me, even though the behaviors I was exhibiting weren't aligned to that character. So just feedback, information on the behavior, you're not your character. Now, for your teams, that psychological safety is paramount. I told you about that incident where I had stonewalled staff where they're just no communication, because we need to be able to share challenges without the fear of repercussion. Now, there's a really, really great framework, 5 dysfunctions of a team, and the fundamental is trust and psychological safety. And I learned that through that lesson, that I needed to learn better communication in teams to focus on what's working, but still call out the things that we need to improve. But how do I do that? And that was through that framework. Now, rewarding that learning and growth, and not just our outcomes, praise, positive praise. It's as silly as patting yourself on the back. Like, there's certain different things you can do. But I feel like the most powerful thing as a leader, doesn't matter if you're running a business or you're educational leader, it's through strategic vulnerability. Now, there's vulnerability where you just overshare and over-empathize, and that becomes a weakness. No, it just genuinely does. But there's a thing called strategic vulnerability, where you share your own learning process, including the mistakes. Hey guys, I've done this thing, I stuffed up here, I've made all these mistakes, but this thing over here worked. Like, I just released a video on Claude, and I showed all the things that I was working on that worked well, but it didn't show all the mistakes necessarily, because it doesn't make for good content. However, in a team-based thing, sharing the mistakes, especially with your students or your colleagues, can help, because you can show what's working and what's not. And you can then demonstrate how this feedback has actually helped you improve what you're trying to learn. Now, that last part of the vulnerability is ask genuine questions that invite others to share their perspectives. I've done this thing, I just failed dismally. Has anyone else had better success? And then see the perspectives, see the insights others can bring. Now, remember that 4th sort of principle we're looking at is build discomfort through resilience, through progressive challenges. Identify your frogs. You got to figure out what are those tasks or conversations you're really avoiding, and deal with them. Go and do them. Schedule it in when you've got the high energy, your focus is at your highest. And then once you've done it, celebrate and act on them fast. Yes, I've done it. Awesome. Well done. I've moved on. Not what's next. Sit in that moment, recognize you've actually done something hard and you've grown from it, because that gradual increase in difficulty actually builds your capacity anyway. And finally, that shift from criticism to curiosity. There's a phrase one of my mentors used to say that instead of getting furious, get curious. And it's just, if someone brings you a problem, instead of just reprimanding them or getting really upset, tell me what was that about? Tell me what led you to make that decision. I try to avoid why questions. Why did you do this? Because why can be seen as like an attack. So just consider that when you have those conversations, especially in a team dynamic. And we're then replacing that I should have done better to what can I learn from this? Switching from what's wrong with me to what approach might work better next time. And then moving from, I've failed, to this strategy just didn't work this time. Remember, there's that principle that Edison with the light bulbs took 1,000 approaches until he actually got it right. He didn't say I failed and then gave up. He just found 1,000 different ways not to make a light bulb until he made one work. So it's really about the perspective shifting from criticism to curiosity. So let's just really quickly wrap up. I want to emphasize that this shift from self-criticism to reflective growth isn't about just lowering your standards, remember. It's about achieving more sustainable, fulfilling success. It's still effort equals results. You put your effort in, you'll get the result. But remember, us high achievers in leadership, aspirational leaders, whatever you might be doing, we can learn to break free from this cycle of harsh self-judgment. Don't become complacent. We really become more innovative and more resilient and ultimately more successful. We're becoming these bigger risks and we're taking on these bigger risks because bigger failures becomes information rather than, a devastation for us. It's the ability to see these failures as wins of this didn't work this time, but I can change and do something different. And it's this ability to identify our worth is not our result. It is the effort that we are putting in. Because remember, doing hard things first isn't just about productivity. It's about building the mental muscle to engage with challenges. Like that's why people do cold plunges. That's why people do ice baths, all those kind of things. It's because they're building up their brain to sort of go, yes, I can deal with this, rather than no, this is going to kill me and run away. It's about just recognizing that value of every step we're actually taking rather than, getting to the next one without celebrating the win that we've just made. So I would love to hear it. If this has resonated sort of with you, let me know in the comment and share your biggest takeaway or how you plan to implement one of these strategies in your life or just your education, leadership, your work. Doesn't matter what it is. What are you going to take away? What's worked well for you today? Because as if you found this valuable, remember, like and subscribe, and then just share it with anyone else you might think will benefit. Remember, effort equals results. The path to mastery isn't about perfection. It's being consistent, compassionate, and growth. Go and see you in the next one.